Thanks for being here this afternoon and joining us for what I think is going to be a really exciting and dynamic panel. As mentioned, I'm Philip Cornell. I'm a senior fellow here at the Atlantic Council and also a principal at Economist Impact. I think this is one of the most consequential energy questions of our time. It's not only this question of abundance and access, it's not just how to unleash more energy production, but it's whether we can build systems that deliver it abundantly, affordably, equitably, especially for those who are underserved and lack access altogether. So this question of energy abundance that we hear so often can sound aspirational, especially in a world where nearly 800 million people still lack access to reliable electricity. But global demand is rising sharply, and capital is moving to supply it where markets are strong in rapidly developing markets or high growth sectors. We've been talking about AI and data centers a lot today. So the challenge is not scarcity of resources or innovation, but it's the ability to unlock scalable, inclusive, and resilient systems that reflect the needs and the capabilities of very different markets. So abundance isn't really the end goal. It's the starting point. So it's how it's structured to meet national ambitions, supporting industrial transformation, and enabling prosperity. So today we're going to explore, I think, a couple of big questions. What does energy abundance mean in practice, especially where affordable and reliable access is lacking? Can it be distributed equitably, or can abundance actually deepen divides? And who leads? Government, finance, innovators, particularly where we need some de-risking or long-term security matters. So to answer some of these questions, I'm really pleased to be joined by such an exceptional panel of leaders. Thomas Hardy is Acting Director of the U.S. Trade and Development Agency, the USTDA. Jude Kearney is on the Board of Advisors of the African Energy Chamber and is the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of Commerce for Africa. Bob Perez is Vice President for Strategic Projects at Baker Hughes. And Tarik Hamane is Group CEO of ONE, or the National Office of Electricity and Drinking Water of the Kingdom of Morocco. So, gentlemen, welcome. So let's start with this question of unpacking what we mean by energy abundance and improving access. It's more than just a supply surplus. We also sort of mean, it seems to me when we talk about it, sovereignty, affordability, sometimes deregulation, sometimes just more fossil fuel, to be honest. So what's the access angle here? And maybe, Tom, I can turn to you. How do you interpret this goal of energy abundance in your work, where it intersects with U.S. policy priorities under this government? And why does improving access even matter within this abundance framework?
Thank you, Philip, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for the invitation to be here today. It's great to be here to put forward where the U.S. Trade and Development Agency is going, the changes that are coming, but also how does the U.S. Trade and Development Agency fit into this energy abundance question. I think our mission's clear. It hasn't changed. How we talk about it is changing. USTDA's purpose now is to focus on making investments that are going to support U.S. national security interests that will make the U.S. safer, stronger, more prosperous. But we don't do that in a vacuum. We can't do that by ourselves. We do that working with our partners in emerging markets, meeting them where they are. Sometimes that will be nuclear energy. Sometimes that will be traditional LNG, gas-fired power. Sometimes that's renewable, captive power, you name it. But I think USTDA, at the end of the day, is the starting point for infrastructure development. We're the first mover. We were talking earlier, USTDA's fund is grant capital. It's the earliest and most difficult to raise in the capital stack. But we're designed to take that early investment risk on major infrastructure projects when we think about energy development. We help to set the stage to bring in American technology, American leadership, but also financing, global financing. We love DFC and EXIM when they come in, but we're just as happy to take financing from around the world to make these projects real. USTDA's project preparation work, whether it's feasibility studies, technical assistance, or pilot projects, help to define the technical requirements, the financing requirements, but it's ultimately to help U.S. competitiveness, help deployment of trusted U.S. solutions, and counter Americans' economic adversaries. I think when we look at activities that are coming forward, it's kind of a three-pronged test for me. It's how does this support our national security? How does this support, what is the likelihood of U.S. exports? And what is the likelihood of financing? And I'll end where I started, which is we're talking about national security, but that's always been an overlay without an explicit overlay. I think back many years ago in Lithuania, the work we did on the LNG import terminal in Klaipėda. USTDA took that early investment, design engineering investment on the LNG import terminal that has fundamentally transformed that area of the world, breaking them free of Russian gas, opening markets for US LNG, and doing so we had a national security angle that's bringing energy to parts of that part of the world that is abundant and is consistent. And we didn't call it national security at the time, but at the end of the day, that's exactly what it was.
Right. So access is kind of a happy outcome of other kind of priorities that you might be following, but presumably also it's a good way of developing markets for U.S. products. Maybe, Jude, you've spoken a lot about the shift from energy poverty to energy prosperity. For African economies, and I feel bad for sort of speaking about them as such a monolith, there's such a diversity of experiences and situations among energy economies in Africa. But what does energy abundance look like in that kind of context? Again, is it more about just more fossil fuel development? Is it about better financing? Does it mean the state stepping back? I mean, how do we achieve access there?
It can mean that each of those has a role to play. But I just want to say why this conversation can be what you started out by saying, Philip, and that is consequential. It is clear, and my focus is on the African continent, it is clear that more needs to be done with regards to both production of capacity and also access. But in regards to what we think of in terms of abundance, there are a number of different buckets of additional abundance that we may need. Number one is access. It is necessarily true that all other things being equal, more people having access to the productiveness of energy will be good for the continent. We also need more abundance among potential investors to openness to markets, like the African market. I think a lot of people just believe that certain markets are uneconomical, non-viable. But, if you ask some of the industries that have been involved in Africa for decades and in some cases centuries, they will tell you some of their best returns come from the African continent. So an abundance of additional consideration for markets like Africa, I think, is important. The last point the last sort of variable that you threw in there is the role of the government. We need an abundance of thoughtfulness and good governance. From governments. When I first encountered the African continent, it was in 1980. I was there as a recent graduate from college, and I had a fellowship. The concept then of governance was essentially stay in office as long as possible and do as much with the state's resources to gird yourself as possible. That, thankfully, is changing considerably. And so that now governments think in terms, I think, probably for their own preservation as well, in terms of a political perspective, that they need to increase access for their populations, because populations are becoming very, very knowledgeable about what's happening around the rest of the world, and they're demanding it in a way that they never did before. So abundance in all of those regards, in terms of access, in terms of openness to the possibilities that you can get a nice return on investing in Africa, and abundance among governments to say, listen, we need to do more for our populations, and our populations will do more for us.
I like that idea of the abundance of sort of knowledge and expectation, especially among the consumers. And maybe I would add, an abundance of knowledge also among sort of the service providers. I think the more knowledge and data that we have about these consumers, the more we might change our view of the risk involved.
That's exactly right.
Bob, maybe I can move to you. You're someone who leads strategic infrastructure initiatives. You've seen how technology and delivery models can really make or break a project. What innovations do you see in sort of project delivery and in innovation technology or partnerships that can unlock these faster results for these sort of harder to reach and underserved markets?
Well, thank you for the question. As I heard my colleagues comment, my answer to the question kept changing. So maybe I'll try this approach on it. When you talk about energy abundance, I think you contrast the difference between the desire and the objective and the reality. And there's a big difference. And then you think about all the avenues that connect the reality and the need for abundance. And you start to bracket, like the question you just asked me, technology. What causes money to move into certain spaces? Are you dealing with markets of need that can afford it? Are you dealing with markets of need that need subsidies or a combination of government support, regulation, and private sector participation? And I think you mentioned a very good point earlier about the timing and the stage at which money is needed. And I would say something I mentioned earlier. In my years of being in the energy industry, which I don't want to admit how many, but it's over 40, I've never seen a good project not get money. The question becomes, how do you get to a good project? So back to, and there's many avenues to this conversation, but if you get back to technology, one example would be early in my career I was involved as a young engineer selling amongst the first combined cycle plants. People take that as a common technology now, but in the late 80s, early 90s, it was new. And at the time, a combined cycle plant was around $1,500 a kilowatt. 10 years later, I was on the buy side developing power projects, and the price of $1,500 came down to less than $300. Now, what happened? Standardization, technology, throughput and volume. So those are things that impact the deployment of technology as an example. Technology innovation, there's a lot of money being put into new technologies to bring energy. But at the end of the day, you then have to combine where it's located. Can you supply fuel? The trick for a utility is how do you combine base load generation with variable generation, which has to be combined to provide a sustainable and consistent supply of energy. So I guess the idea I would leave the group with, and for further discussion maybe, is where is the difference between where you'd like to get and where we are today, and then how you connect those dots. And I think the answer will be very different in every market. I mean, I heard earlier this morning, and I won't go too much longer, about the robust growth in power demand in the U.S. The FERC has mentioned a number as high as 150 gigawatts required in the next 5 years. Whether it's 100, 150, it's a lot. How this market responds to meeting energy abundance, I'm going to presume is very different in Africa, and, for example, Latin America or other parts of the world.
But I mean, and you talk about sort of the cost decreases that come along with technology development, for example, in combined cycle plants. You know, I'm also struck by the fact that for a while now, there have been restrictions by those governments or institutions that drive financing to places that need access around some specific fuels. And that has actually hindered a lot of delivering that abundance in some of these markets. And I know that's being sort of re-examined now. I mean, we saw sort of recent rethinking in places like the World Bank around things like gas and also nuclear. Tarik, speaking about different technologies, maybe I can move to you. I think it's interesting to see in Morocco that has positioned itself as such a leader in renewable energy, utility scale renewable energy, and as a big, let's say, fossil fuel importing country, that's in the name of affordability, of bringing abundance, and really banking on electricity grid development and the renewable sector. Can you talk a little bit about how you think about energy abundance for Morocco within ONE and even the wider region?
Thank you very much. Thank you for the Atlantic Council for the invitation. Maybe I want to start by first definition. I mean, depending who you ask about abundance, the answer will be different. If you ask the 800 million people that has no access to electricity, the abundance will be access to electricity. If you ask people in the wood that have no electricity, the abundance will be access to enough wood in order to cook. So it's mainly depending on the demand, on the need. In my opinion, of course, first step, as was mentioned, is access. And here, I mean, Morocco has been also a leader on that field. We start a large program in order to enhance the access within the rural area. This program has been launched in '96. At that time, we used to have 6% of the population that have in the rural areas have access, so almost 84% without access. And within 10 years, we deploy a program, we already reach 80%. After 20 years, 99%. And of course, today we are almost on 100% access with a quite interesting framework involving all parties, of course, the utility, the government, the community, but the population itself, that allow everybody considering this path to access its own contribution. This was a great success, and we even export this configuration, this setup in Africa, and we have developed some project together with some African neighbors. So first for me is access. Second aspect is cost. Mm-hmm. In order to make this access accessible and durable, we need to structure it with the appropriate cost. And here we consider the appropriate, let's say, mixed of the grid. We mentioned fossil. We start introducing also renewables quite early in Morocco, from 1999, first project. Then in 2009, we set up a strategy where we gave a quite important portion of the mix, considering renewable energy. By today, we have 45% of our capacity from renewables, wind, solar, and hydro, and we aim to reach at least 52% by 2020. This is addressing, of course, the mix to be also considering the sovereignty and the security of supply. This is also an important aspect, and it reaches both the pricing side, because if you do use your own resources, especially if it's renewables, you make a kind of hedging of the tariff by the end of the day. And the other aspect is the sustainability. So for me, it's a kind of building where you have to implement this aspect. This is, let's say, as mentioned before, the old world. Today, with the new technology, with DI, we are entering into another phase. And this is how, let's say, the developed world is going to see the abundance. And I like to make an analogy with what happens in the telecom side. When the telecom and the mobile phone start, 90s, it was a kind of privilege to access to this facility. Today, everybody had this. And for me, if I can make an analogy of abundance, is to have the same path within the power sector. So everybody has access to the power on a quite open base tarification. So we should build a system quite similar to what happens within the telecom side in order really to deploy. One of the main aspects to manage, because we were talking about generation mainly from the beginning of this of today, increasing more capacity to address the EI need, but we have to consider also grid aspects. As a grid operator, we are facing of course, the increase of the demand, driven by industrialization of the country, but also we expect that massive need will come from AI. And during the last 20 years, people were more focusing on generation, and tourism, renewables, flexibility, etc. But the investment on the grid requested in order to bring in all this capacity will be massive. And we should be aware about what is needed. the time that takes, and also the investment needed.
Yeah, and I think what you're saying is very right. There's no question that sort of AI over the longer term has the ability to deliver abundance across all parts of the economy, including in terms of the energy sector. But certainly for now, it's demanding a whole hell of a lot of capital and energy demand, and it's a relatively low-risk sector to supply. I mean, I was hearing in one of the roundtables, sort of a turbine producer saying, look, I'm going to send my limited turbines to places that have easy, low-risk projects, and that's probably not the same places that necessarily need energy access. So maybe we can talk about abundance. You know, abundance doesn't always guarantee fairness or equal distribution in this sort of access question. So even in very fast-growing markets, it's how do we translate that, right? So there are these big incentives to build out and scale certain parts of the energy economy. But how do we avoid leaving behind things like rural electrification or these higher risk capital deployments that can enable access? So maybe, Jude, maybe I can turn to you first on this one. You know, how do we think about sort of ensuring that kind of equity within the capital deployments into energy sectors in countries like in Africa?
I think one of the things that needs to happen is for us to recognize that, for instance, in Africa and other developing countries, there is one player that has a greater vested interest in, for instance, creating both additional capacity as well as additional access, is government. And that's true here as well. Governments have an inherent and vested interest in providing things that they don't necessarily get a return on. Everyone else is looking at this from a return perspective. So we have to make sure that we spend time with governments to talk about, you know, all of the greater benefits of additional access and additional capacity, because in the long run, they're the only ones who are going to be able to take that risk. So I'm hoping that, you know, and it's happening. That governments are beginning to recognize that, first of all, from a political perspective, they can't ignore the great unlit parts of their population. 20 years ago, when I was living on the continent, I was living in a southern African country, and I was advising their state utility, electricity utility. And it was going gangbusters, and it was a very wealthy utility. And I remember that a group of us gave them some advice to say, hey, listen, I know that it's somewhat of a dirty word, but have you considered, you know, incorporating greater private sector involvement in this sector, at least to take the things that they don't find overly risky. You will deal with the things that are relatively more risky. But from the perspective of many governments, and not just African governments, but other governments as well, they view controlling electricity and electric production and utilities as a form of protection. And so it has taken quite a while for them to recognize that everyone has a bigger role to play in this production and this access. And so that's the thing that we need to just be prepared to preach and to support, you know, empirically, that it actually does make an improvement of society to improve access.
Yeah, and you know, it's up to governments to ensure that there's sort of this access. I think you're exactly right. I think it goes back to that question before, that the more that we see, you know, some support with information around the market, if I think about sort of, again, rural African consumers where you have sort of off-grid companies that are now delivering very affordable electricity absent government support. And really the question then becomes, does the local utility feel threatened by this kind of development? But, you know, on the other side, Thomas, you in many cases are going to be the agency that provides that kind of first mile support for these kind of projects. Again, we were talking a little bit about all the U.S. national interests that are embedded in bringing that. But when it comes specifically to this issue of providing more access, let's say in really rural parts of developing countries. What's the challenges that you're facing, and how do you see sort of the national interest there?
The challenges are, I think what Bob was saying, good projects are easy to get financed. When you talk about rural access, you start talking about loan repayments and so forth. So that's always a challenge. I think part of it is creativity. I think back to a project we did in Nigeria. It was an LNG processing and distribution. On its face, pretty straightforward. But what we were able to do was we were able to bring InfraCredit, which is a Nigerian financier, in, and they were able to provide debt financing and Naira-based debt financing, something that wasn't a traditional place. They were normally in the capital markets. By bringing InfraCredit in, they were able to get Naira-based financing. So you're now getting the ability to expand access into Nigeria for energy. Similarly, I think of some work we're doing in Libido Corridor in Zambia. It's a solar plus transmission designed primarily to reach into the copper belt in Congo, in southern Congo. But I think what that's going to do is, yes, you have an off-taker on the mining operations, but you're now going to be able to reach into villages, reach into towns, reach into cities along that corridor that may not have access or may not have continuous access, and provide them access. So it's not necessarily going to be a straight line that you would traditionally see in a LNG project or gas-fired power project in a more developed economy. It's how do you think more creatively of how do you make the investment that may have an off-taker on the mining sector. Critical minerals is going to be a big investment for USTDA. We're specifically called out in the president's executive order on critical minerals. So that's going to be a significant investment. A lot of that's going to be energy generation and transmission. So how do we make sure that the work we're doing on that transmission is getting into markets that may not otherwise have the energy?
Bob, maybe I can turn it to you. I mean, we heard then a little bit about how there's sort of interaction with local government that's necessary. What kind of external financing and de-risking mechanisms might sort of encourage and, as you were saying, make a good project good? What's your experience in terms of those kind of partnerships or policy tools for enabling energy infrastructure at scale, and where do you see some of that untapped opportunity?
I'll maybe key off first on your comment. I think most governments don't really focus on the impact on GDP with the lack of power. So when you look at major outages, which many countries have and are going to experience when they compete for new capacity, the impact on GDP is almost 100% correlated. And that, when you start looking at the economics that way, that's when you really get the governments interested in saying, boy, it's not just a day of blackouts, it's now impacting the industrial capacity and the productivity of a country. So I think that's a very important factor in all of these conversations of how to engage governments and make it a greater social interest in addition to the economic impact. I think that's very important. In terms of working with government, I had the experience of working with a national oil company as a public-private partnership for over a decade, and there's tremendous advantage in doing that if you can get the right dynamics. People in these organizations know the problems and they know the answers. What they don't have is the tools and the agility to make things happen when they're within a government organization. And that's exacerbated by the moment in time that we are now. I made briefly the comment as we were walking in. The moment we are in right now happens every 25 years. And what I mean by that is I started my career in the early 80s in the power generation and in the nuclear business. And I recall the old-timers back in the 70s would talk about how they would take purchase orders for 1,000-megawatt turnkey coal-fired power plants over the phone. People would call them up and say, I need 1,000 megawatts, and they'd quote it over the phone. That's how much of a seller's market it was. Well, that didn't happen again till the late 90s, early 2000s, where here in the United States, there was a significant increase in gas-fired generation driven by very efficient combined cycles, very efficient business model, which were the independent power producers that came into play when the PURPA Act really came into full swing in the U.S., and people were buying gas turbines like crazy. And if you wanted one, you had to buy 10 or 5. Well, here we are 25 years later, and it's happening again. And the underlying drivers have been different each time, but the bottom line is that you have a situation where the market demand is way outstripping supply chain. Today, there are 3 big gas turbine manufacturers, and there are 3 small gas turbine manufacturers. 30 years ago, there was 15. So what's happened is you've had a constraint in terms of capacity, and then you have a tremendous amount of demand, which has surprised many people. I recently had a conversation with a very senior person from one of the largest data center operators in the world, and we were talking about power requirements for a particular site that they were developing, and he made the comment, we used to think about, well, where does power come from? It comes from the wall. You plug it in, you get power. Well, really, when you break down the requirement, it was all about gas supply, pipeline capacity, interconnection to the grid, and now even more complicated with the load profile of AI. So I might have gotten off track, but what I'm trying to do is illuminate some of the complexities that are inherent to developing good energy supply and how all the pieces are interrelated. The supply of fuel, how do you get it there? Do you transport it by wire? Do you transport it by pipe? So all very sophisticated and specific requirements that ultimately impact the growth opportunities and the ability to service not only the markets that can afford to pay for it and require government intervention, but also the ones that can pay for it but require a coordination in a scale, because everything about energy is scale and repeatability and standardization, and that's how you bring down cost.
Jude, maybe I could just pass back to you. I mean, some of these things that Bob was talking about in particularly this seller's market right now, that squeeze for either whether it's gas turbines we were mentioning or sort of or other kind of infrastructure will end up squeezing a lot of African economies that are right now in an industrialization phase where gas is especially important, not just for generating electricity, but for driving all sorts of industrial growth, chemical production that are really good for the economy, create some pretty high value jobs. Before, that constraint might have also been on a policy side, right? I'm thinking about European export credit agencies or multilateral development banks. We talked about sort of picking out certain fuels that they were going to discriminate against. How does Africa compete for that really necessary energy and abundant energy to reach some of its industrialization goals, right? So not just on the power side.
You know, we were talking before the panel started about this concept of the use of fossil fuels, for instance. And, the truth of the matter is fossil fuel is needed not just in Africa, but it's still needed in a lot of different places. But, the important thing is that the mix is changing. But the point for Africa is not to view its fossil fuels as the answer to greater electrification. It's to use it as currency. They have a product, a commodity that will, if managed well and produced well, and they have good partners, will fund the rest of their goals in regards to a greater diversity of power. As you probably know, or you may know, many African countries now actually are showing a preference to renewable. But in order for them to play their role in funding it, they need something that they don't otherwise have other than through their natural resources. So they have to produce those natural resources in order to play the role that they want to play in bringing renewables to the table. And I see them doing that. And I think each of us on your panel have a sort of an inherent role that we can play. We bring something to the table that I think will advance this whole discussion. Obviously, TDA has been one of the best run organizations, and I told this to Tom earlier, in the last 20, 30 years, and they still are. They have to maybe, word their work differently now in terms of who the ultimate beneficiary is. Maybe it's U.S. Companies that can go in behind the TDA funding. But their role is important. The African Energy Chamber, we have a role to play in regards, and we have the government's ears. We have a role to play in regards to making sure governments understand that increasing capacity through a managed way is its own reward, both politically, financially, and developmentally. And so we're busy doing that. Obviously, Baker Hughes is world-renowned for its capacity and its technology and its ability and its successes in a lot of places, both in the developed world as well as the developing world. So, and then Morocco, it hasn't been discussed, but Morocco, which has been a Eurocentric part of the European, I think, economy for a while, is also turning its attention to Africa in a way that is beneficial to Africa, because you've shown great interest in sort of participating in the development of Africa. So all of us coming together to follow through on this conversation is going to be really, really helpful to Africa.
Yeah, I think we started off the day really highlighting the importance of those partnerships. Tarik, let me give you the last word. So speaking specifically about partnerships that Morocco has engaged in, obviously you engaged a lot with European finance in the past. You're very much a leader in terms of regional interconnection and trade of different kinds. What are the kind of partnerships that are especially important to bring abundant energy to Morocco that serves some of those access or development interests for the Moroccan economy?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I mean, at that stage, I mean, I can make a differentiation between generation, transmission, and distribution. In order to build a sustainable system, electrical system, I think that right now the private sector are quite ready to invest on the power generation side, and we have to encourage it. The example of Morocco, today more than 90% of the generation are done by the private sector, either through IPPs with the grid operator or through the open market, B2B supply of electricity. The key elements for development, is the grid, and this has to be driven by the government. So governments, through, of course, the partnership with the IFIs, supporting the investment on the grid in order to support, to build a real system that can allow this access and bring the abundance in the future. Distribution side also, private sector dismantle that they can bring value. So this is, I think, one of the key elements we have to address, involving the private sector as much as we can, where they can bring value. First, partnership. IFIs in general, whether World Bank or European banks or African development banks, has their role to play in order to support, to build this grid, which need more long-term investment, low return, because it's quite massive infrastructure, and the return it's quite long in terms of time. Another aspect, of course, is interconnections. In order to optimize the whole systems and bring more add value, of course, from the fossil, flexibility coming from gas, but also renewables, we need to enhance the interconnection between the countries. We were talking before the panel about Spain and how important is the interconnection. We are connected with Spain. We have experienced the blackout, and we support them to reestablish the grid. And this shown how important is interconnection, and we are today developing an interconnection with Mauritania, our southern neighbor, in order to really build an integrated system which can now goes from Ghana till and from even Nigeria to Morocco to Europe, and this can bring a real add value. So this is basically for me the key elements to implement, to support in order to bring this abundance to Africa.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, grid integration is basically a physical manifestation of the kinds of partnerships and interdependence that we're talking about to bring abundance and access. Great. Well, we're going to leave it there for the time, but I want to thank my panel, Thomas Hardy, Jude Kearney, Bob Perez, Tarik Hamane. Thanks very much for joining me, gentlemen. Cheers.